Thank you all. Ms. Martin, would you please call the roll?
Yes, ma'am. Commissioner Rich?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Martins?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Balance? Yes, ma'am. Commissioner Coppinger?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Graham?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Volkert? Commissioner Gay?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Warren? Commissioner Madison?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Houston? Chair Runner.
Yes, ma'am. Everyone's had a chance to review the summary minutes of the March 15th meeting. Are there any corrections to those minutes? No corrections. I'd ask for a motion.
So moved.
Thank you. We need a second. Thank you.
Commissioner Rich? Commissioner Martins?
Abstain.
Commissioner Balance? Commissioner Coppinger?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Graham?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Gay?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Warren?
Abstain.
Commissioner Madison?
Abstain.
Chair Runner.
Yes, ma'am. I think there were 14 subdivision approvals. Any questions on those? No questions. No letters of credit or performance bonds. No unfinished business. We'll move on to the public hearing. And tonight that we are here to consider a text amendment to the zoning ordinance and to revise Article 1 through 8 and Appendix A and B. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Chair Runner. I just give you a quick update and tell you what we're going to run through the changes tonight. So we've had 2 public meetings, and we've met with one special interest group, the Home Builders Association. We meet with the Realtors Association on Monday. So we've already conducted those 3 meetings. We'll conduct another one Monday. Tonight, we're going to ask you, after we go through these changes, assuming that we get all the questions answered tonight, to recess this and then continue it on April 19th and actually take the vote the 19th. We'll just go ahead and go through these changes tonight. With that, I'll go ahead and jump right in. So as part of your package that you got, we have this zoning ordinance revision summary reference document. I think we may have, I don't know if we talked about that last time or not, but that is posted on our website, also at warrenpc.org. But this presentation largely follows this document here, the summary reference document. Of course, our main changes are also on the website. Those are our typical red changes are in red. You have red underlines or additions, red strike-throughs or deletions. We have, the zoning ordinance itself is over 425 pages, and the majority of those pages have some form and change. So we created this document to try to highlight and go through the changes that were, I guess, considered major changes or significant changes. We have a lot of kind of housekeeping and wordsmithing stuff that are in there as well. So as we go through the slides, you can kind of follow along and see that, and then if you see something you want to see what the actual text says, then on the left-hand side, that article and section will tell you what, of course, article and section number it is, and then on the right-hand side of the page is the actual page number in that specific article that contains those changes, or multiple pages if in some instances. So we'll jump right in this. I'll start out with kind of going through the Articles 1 through 3 changes, and then I'll hand it off to Rachel, and she'll go over Article 4 and 5, and then I'll finish up with Articles 6, 7, and 8. So we've talked a little bit about the new Comprehensive Development Review Process and Committee. So that's a collaborative review process that we got together with, of course, our staff, but the city and the county staff, and looked at a specific model from other agencies and tailored that to our community. And then we've also involved all our public and private utilities and involved some auxiliary agencies as well, where we'll look at development comprehensively from the idea stage, the planning stage, all the way through the building and construction stage. So there's a lot of changes involved, Article 1 through 3, with all of that. We hope that improves, of course, communication and collaboration among all of our agencies, but also with the development community, and hopefully we'll all together deliver better projects to the community and have more community-oriented projects, something that represents a smoother process that is more efficient and delivers compliant projects. With those changes also creates the Comprehensive Development Review Committee, and that'll just be a committee of largely staff members of planning staff, but also our sister agencies will comment on preliminary development plans. So again, that's the initial stage. We'll also provide development review, coordination, and comments, again, throughout the entire process from the inception, the idea stage, through the occupancy stage, construction and occupancy stage. And then we'll review the site development plans, which you'll learn is going to kind of take the place of the DDPs here in a minute, the next section there. But that committee will also make recommendations as staff to our staff for approval, and then different types of approval. It could be conditional approval if something's okay, but needs to be checked on later. So all of those options are there. So something I know this board has discussed several times before is the detailed development plan process. So you know that process now. I won't go over that, but basically the staff reviews everything. We pass that around to other sister agencies, and then it comes to you all in the form of a public hearing. We kind of go through our long list of checklist items that we go through, and then of course you either concur or not with that. Since I've been here, there hasn't been one that's been questioned. So we're going to replace that process with a site, what we're going to call a site development plan. And what that will do is separate out the civil site reviews from the building permit. So a detailed development plan has specific thresholds that we look at. If it meets those, then it has to go before the Planning Commission. If it does not, it just goes through the regular permitting process where you go through the building permit. That has created some issues and some kind of disjointed review processes amongst our sister agencies as well as the Planning Commission. So what this will do is allow us to review all those civil and site work items as one separate review, and then at the same time or in parallel with that, they can review the building permit, the architectural stuff, and they aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but they don't necessarily, one doesn't necessarily have to hold up the other now, and then we can compress those review times down to about 3 weeks instead of the current 30-plus day review with detailed development plans. As a secondary benefit, we don't have the detailed development plans on our agenda as we currently do. Typically, those take 15 to 20 minutes per item. So we have converted that public hearing requirement into just a public review, almost exactly like we do our subdivisions. You had a stack of those tonight. You get those, you look through them. If there's any questions, of course, we'll address those. If not, then that's kind of that public review process. So we're not completely eliminating the public review process. A site work permit is a new term also, so that will just be whenever you do a site development plan, it will eventually lead to a site work permit, and then through the construction and compliance stage, once you complete everything you said you were going to do on the site plan, then you would get a certificate of completion that would basically serve the same as a building permit, and you'll have to get that prior to getting a certificate of occupancy. Moving along, the binding elements. So here's another big one. So binding elements will be changed to development plan conditions. So through research, we found in the Kentucky Revised Statutes that binding elements, kind of a term reserved for a consolidated local government, metropolitan government, or some other type of merged government. Of course, we are not that here in Warren County. So we used another common planning term that's not found in KRS specifically, I don't believe, but it's commonly used as development plan conditions. They work pretty much in the exact same way as binding elements, and are remaining in the same effect and enforced in the same manner as binding elements. And then also any previous items established at binding elements still continue and still will remain in effect. So it's I guess an owner doesn't just automatically get out of those. They still get to stay in effect. It's just from now on, we'll be calling those development plan conditions to be a little more in compliance with KRS. Public notice requirements. So this is in response to sometimes criticism that we get, but also just to try to be more, I guess, open and reach more people when we have public hearings and afford more of the public due process. So zone change and conditional use letters currently just go to adjacent property owners, so properties that touch or would touch if there were no road or railroad or river. So what we're going to do is expand that boundary now to 200 feet of the property to be rezoned, and everyone that has property that touches that new buffer would get a letter or notifications indicating that there'll be a zone change or conditional use near them. Key piece of that is the adjacent owners list is still required as part of the application. That's typically furnished by a surveyor engineer. That will still be the requirement, but Planning Commission staff will use our GIS system then to just capture the rest of those addresses, so that'll help alleviate that burden on the applicants. And likewise, variances, if we have a variance notification that is for a dimension or a distance that is beyond 200 feet, so we have some things that say 200 feet, some say 1,000 feet, some say 1,500 feet. Whatever that dimension is, we'll expand that notification out to that dimension, rather than just adjacent property owners. So again, we're trying to reach more people and make sure the notification gets out. Variances versus waivers, similar to the binding elements. So variances are typically reserved in KRS for dimensional things, but we, as a matter of standard practice, do variances for things that are areas or percentages or those types of things. Still a common practice, still a common thing done in the planning realm, I guess. But the term variance is typically for those dimensional things. So we introduce the term waiver to cover those percentages and areas and those types of things. So it's basically the exact same process as a variance, be a board of adjustment action or planning commission in conjunction with a application similar to what you hear. But we'll make sure those are called out in staff reports, and it'll be clear what we mean there. Not major changes, so I wanted to make sure that we call out two bigger items or that were discussed but were decided not to change. One is the connection to sanitary sewer. We had a lot of discussion, probably 3 or 4 different meetings by lots of sister agency and staff from sister agencies, and basically it was decided to leave the language as is, that any new development or new lots within 2,000 feet of sewer will have to still connect to sewer. So that requirement is not changing, but we did discuss that. Of course, a couple of the main reasons why that that rule was instituted and why we're keeping it is environmental concerns in our karst environment. Obviously, it's a very unique environment here that you're all well aware of, but also just helps us keep a better balance with our utilities and growth. Having that sewer requirement served us pretty well as far as directing some of your more intense uses to areas that have sewer. And then, of course, the third piece is this community has expanded sewer out to Alvaton, out to Plano, and out to Nashville Road and on up past Smiths Grove. So we've got a large area of sewer that is available to be connected to as well. Final action on development plan conditions. That was another thing that was discussed at the request of some of our legislative folks, but it was decided that, so what the request specifically was is, so the Planning Commission accepts the binding elements at the zone change level, then that recommendation for the zone change gets sent to the legislative body. typically, well, I guess every time that I'm aware of, the binding elements that the Planning Commission accepted are kept as the binding elements. The request was made for us to look at allowing the legislative bodies to then amend those also, not just affirm the zone change or overturn. So we looked at that, and after discussion with an expanded group of commissioners and fiscal court members, I think they decided just to keep that the same and not open that up for a couple of reasons. One is it pretty much would constitute that an additional hearing, public hearing, would have to take place, and under the whatever the new proposed set of binding elements were. So it was discussed and decided to keep the same. Another thing is traffic impact studies. No stranger on topic for this board. So what we're proposing to do is change our thresholds to match the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet thresholds or Bowling Green and Warren County's requirements. With that, though, Bowling Green and Warren County are also looking to change their requirement to the Transportation Cabinet thresholds. So we will have one requirement now instead of up to 3 potential different ones for a traffic impact study. So it helps us keep that same message to the development community. Anytime you have the same requirement, it hopefully makes it easier on them and easier for everybody else to understand as well. The second piece of that, which I know this board's aware of, is our traffic impact study analysis. Do you need one or not? So often we rely on our transportation experts at the city or the county or the state to negotiate improvements in lieu of doing a traffic study, so the developer can put their money that they would have put into traffic studies into those improvements, especially in the instances where they probably can pretty much guess what those traffic impact studies are going to say anyway. So install a turn lane, just agree to that, and we'll all be okay. So that's our current practice. So we added that language in, and it pretty much mirrors what we approved for our subdivision regulations. I guess that's probably been about 1.5 years ago now. Just at the bottom of this slide, there's our current traffic impact study thresholds. 20,000 square feet of non-residential space, greater than 50 residential units, or any other use generating 500 or more average daily trips. Nobody can really figure out where those numbers came from exactly as far as who set them, why they were set that way. So it makes some sense to take a look at those again. And so then the KYTC standard and our proposed threshold is to defer to them as just 100 trips during the AM or PM peak hour. So it relies on when traffic is the most intense, the peak hour. If you generate at least 100 trips during that peak hour, that's when the traffic impact study will now be required. Another change that I want to clarify some about the alternate zoning process. So I think there was a article in the newspaper that got it mostly right, but there's a few key details that I think we need to make sure we clarify here. This just simply inserts the alternate zoning process as an option into the zoning ordinance. It doesn't mean we're automatically going to do this every single time. So what is this? Basically, it's KRS 100.211 is our typical zone change process that we follow. Well, the alternate zoning process, just add another 1, so it's 2111. So it allows for the Planning Commission's decision to stand after 21 days if nobody wants the next level, the legislative body, to hear the case. And it literally means everybody. It's any member of the public or any member of the legislative body wants to hear the case, then they can just request and do so. They just have to do it within 21 days of the Planning Commission's decision. If that happens and that takes place, then that hearing can either still be a hearing on the record, which is what most of the city and county usually does, or it can be a whole new hearing, which they don't typically do, don't know, if maybe one instance that they have in history that I've heard about. But in either case, then that will be re-advertised just the same as it was in the beginning. So that would be the only difference. The legislative bodies will have a choice of whether they want to do that again, and then even if they choose to do that, then we'll still have to work with them as far as their procedure or how they want to initiate that. So what specific things that somebody will follow, what happens when is it written, does it have to be a written challenge, can it be an email, and then does the planning commission staff re-advertise it, or do the city or county? So all of those details would have to be worked out. So this is it's a good thing. There's pros and cons to both. It potentially reduces the amount of time for a zone change by 3 to 4 weeks minimum if there's no challenge, but then if there is, then of course it could lengthen it. So there's pros and cons with both, but they will have to decide which they choose. Amendments to the development plan, and then PUD. One of the key things that we've learned over time is that 100% signature requirement to either amend binding elements or a plan unit development is probably often is a little too stringent. That allows for one single person or entity out of an entire subdivision or development to potentially block a change, which may be favorable, but you can't even decide whether it's favorable or not, or go to a public hearing if that one person or one entity won't sign. So reducing that to 75% we think is a positive change, and it will allow for some changes in the development. There's always that one neighbor, there's always that one entity from time to time that doesn't allow, just will not sign it, just doesn't want to, it's not going to. But one key thing is 75% ownership is still more than a supermajority. So supermajorities, majority's 51%, supermajority's 66%. This is 75%. So I think it's still highly unlikely that any non-desirable thing to happen in a development is still probably not going to happen with 75% signature. Another change is on accessory apartments. So this is again in response to some of the public requests to have some changes in this area. So we've clarified that accessory apartments are for family only, so they truly are intended to be like a granny flat or a mother-in-law suite or something like that, where it's your actual family that you're taking care of in a separate suite. Clarified that the primary residence must be occupied by the owner. So again, it's try to clarify that it's not intended just to end up being a duplex or a second unit. Hey, I rent this out, now I want an accessory apartment. That was never the intent. And again, this is in single family zones. That's up to the owner, but by current definition and by these clarifications, only a family member can live there, or a definition of the family which is no more than 2 unrelated people. So you could have somebody unrelated to you living there currently, but not by these changes. So if you choose to have a mother-in-law suite or whatever, if mother-in-law either passes on or decides she's sick of you and moves out, then you do have that vacant space, but it's no different than if they were just in the room next to you. You can convert it to a playroom or a game room or whatever, but it's not, again, it's trying to help protect the character of the single family residences, and we've got, especially in a college town, we've got a lot of violations of that. That would be where you would be allowed to have that one unrelated person still be there. So it's again, we're trying to find that balance between protecting our single-family neighborhoods, which are one family, in theory, one family in that one home, and our subdivisions that are developed as single-family, but still allow some of the options that we know are more prevalent in recent times of having caregivers and family members and that type of thing. Got something to add?
That may be worth clarifying if that's the direction we want to go, because the way it's currently worded, a caregiver, if the proposed changes were adopted as written, would not be allowed to reside there.
We can,
So we can add that.
yeah,
That's an
that's an easy
easy
one. It's a good clarification. It does, and it does happen. You're right. Typically, caregivers do not live there. They just come during the day while you work, but there are instances where there are. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure, understood. Yeah, I think that's a good clarification. We can. Right, it still would. Mm-hmm.
That's for, that's for current.
proposed changes
Yeah.
specifically state that no one
Mm-hmm.
at all can be in the latest.
Yeah.
But I think the caregiver is a good
Yeah.
instance for an accessory apartment.
Mm. Yeah, we've made that distinction with accessory apartment. Yeah. So the primary residence must be occupied by the owner. We've also said that they can't alter the character of the residence or pattern of development in the neighborhood, so don't just glom on something on the front of your house or whatever just to add something for a second unit. With that, entrances to the accessory apartments must be located on the side or the rear of the structure. You don't want to take the front of your house and have, you know, two primary entrances to where it looks like a duplex. So that's pretty much those changes. Is there any other questions on those? It is a great question. We're even going to change it for you, it sounds like. So with that, I'm going to get into Article 4, and I'll let Rachel take over here.
All right, so moving into Article 4. And Article 4 basically outlines each zoning district and all of the specific development standards for each of the different zones that we have. So I'm going to kind of go in order, starting with agriculture and work our way all the way through industrial and some of the special overlay districts. So starting off with the agricultural zone, not a whole lot is proposed to change in this section. We did clarify the exception lot rule. So basically we have an exception lot rule where you can have a tract of land that's less than 5 acres, which is typically the minimum in the agricultural zone. So in the case, you know, someone may have a 40-acre agricultural piece of land and maybe they've got their home there, but they have a son or daughter and they just want to cut off one lot for them to build a home on. We've got this exception lot option to say, well, you're able to cut off an exception lot for family member or whoever it may be. But in the past, it's kind of been implied that you would have to have a tract of land that actually remains after that subdivision. But if you're going to add it to an adjoining piece, we don't care if you do that. So that was really kind of what we were clarifying in this section. Also, our conservation subdivision overlay district, which is currently written in the zoning ordinance. It's a permitted overlay by right. Today, we're proposing some changes that would require a public hearing similar to a rezoning request. It wouldn't actually be changing the zoning. It would just essentially be establishing the overlay district. So that is one of the major changes we're proposing with this specific overlay district. We have clarified that an 18-foot road is required to receive a density bonus. That doesn't prevent someone from actually improving the road to get to that 18-foot width for a density bonus. We've also expanded areas that are eligible for a conservation subdivision. This would match our comprehensive plan changes that went into effect in January. And we've also proposed to increase density bonuses from 2 to 2.5 times when you're utilizing an on-site septic system, and then also from 4 to 5 if you're utilizing sewer. I think I've hit on some of the things at the bottom of the slide already. The area that you, so I guess I should back up and explain what a conservation subdivision is for those of you who may not be familiar with it. But basically, it's an option where you would start out with a minimum of 40 acres, and you're going to dedicate half of that into a conservation area that would be essentially in perpetuity a minimum of 20 years, but after that 20-year time frame, everyone who's part of that subdivision would then have to agree that they were going to give up that area in conservation if they wanted to develop it. But if not, then that would just remain in conservation. And so I guess the benefits of a conservation subdivision, I know a lot of times you all are probably most familiar with this I guess complaint maybe, I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but we'll have public hearings and neighbors may show up and say, oh, my beautiful view is going away, and you know, unfortunately they don't own that view, it's just borrowed, you know, until someone has a plan for something else. And so with a conservation subdivision, if you buy a lot in the conservation subdivision and your lot backs up to the areas that are in conservation and all the homes are clustered in one area, you're basically buying into that view, so it's going to be preserved. You're not going to have to worry about someone developing that land because it is the part of the development that's in conservation. These conservation areas can be natural areas, wooded areas. They could actually be, you know, actively farmed.
Question in the earlier presentation, but just for clarification, they could also be in floodplain. Is that accurate?
Yep. Part of that could be in the floodplain. Really anything would essentially qualify for a conservation area as long as it's not the portion that's being developed with your homes or your roads and infrastructure and that type of thing. So these are just some examples if you were going to develop a conservation subdivision, how the density bonus would work. So just the first example there, the proposed changes would allow a density bonus of up to 250%. So that's based on the number of lots that would be permitted just in the standard agricultural zone. So if you had 40 acres and you just wanted to subdivide 5-acre tracts, you could do 8 5-acre tracts, but then you tack on that density bonus there, and that's where we come up with the 20 single-family homes. I think I did the math right. Yeah. And then, so on sanitary sewer, you can see what a density of 500% would look like. Again, you would be clustering your homes in one specific location. Other benefits to the developer in that case mean, you know, your road network's shorter, there's less cost involved with development from that perspective as well. So this is just an example out of the ordinance. This would be the development standards you would follow if you were going to develop a conservation subdivision with your setbacks and lot coverages and that type of thing. Moving on to our single family section, we have added options for attached single family and single family zones. So today, if you want to do some type of attached single family product, you have to actually zone multifamily. Those are the only zones that currently allow attached units like a townhome or a twin home. So we have tried to build in some flexibility in certain zones to allow attached single family as long as each unit is platted on its own lot. We have also created specific development standards to go along with these types of development. And we've also proposed to increase permitted lot coverage in all of our RS districts, so RS1A, B, C, and D. Those are our sewered single-family zones. We have changed our parking requirements. Currently, for a single-family use, in all of the single-family zones, you're supposed to provide a minimum of 2 spaces per dwelling unit. But we are proposing to increase this slightly. You know, in today's time, we're auto dependent. We have, you know, kids that are becoming of driving age, and so then maybe a family of 4 ends up with 4 vehicles, and maybe 2 spaces might not necessarily be enough. But we would still count any type of garage space you had. So if you had a 2-car garage and then a 2-car driveway, you would essentially have 4 spaces. So you would likely meet the requirement anyway, but we did propose a slight increase for some of that. Let's see. We've also tried to clarify the maximum area of the front yard that you can pave for parking. So currently you're limited to 25% of your front yard, which I don't know how that regulation is. It's kind of just gone through time and never changed, but now some of our districts for example, RS1D, your lot width is only 50 feet. So 25% of 50 is not really enough to fit parking and without going over the 25% limitations. So we've actually kind of tried to scale it a little bit better based on, lots that are larger in width would have a smaller percentage that they could cover, but then, for example, the RS1D lots, we've increased the percentage to something that's more reasonable. We've also clarified accessory structure and fence regulations. And for properties that are zoned ag, rural residential, or residential estate where you have at least 1 acre, we have proposed to permit larger accessory structures. Right now, you're limited to no more than the square footage of your home. So if you've got a 1,500 square foot home, but you need a 2,000 square foot workshop, our ordinance wouldn't currently allow that. That is something that's routinely varied before the Board of Adjustments with no opposition. So we felt that just kind of based on previous applications, it might be a good idea to revisit that standard. So that's where that change comes from. And then we've also tried to build in some flexibility in our downtown area. For single-family lots, there are certain blocks downtown where the lot sizes may be even smaller than 5,000 square feet, which is our smallest lot area that's permitted in the zoning ordinance. And so if it fits in with the character of an existing pattern of development in a specific block downtown, we are trying to build in some flexibility to encourage smaller lot sizes in the RS1D zone. Moving on to our multifamily section, we are proposing to eliminate the density cap in RM4. So currently, you basically have a minimum lot area for your first unit, and then for each additional unit, you have to have an additional amount of lot area in order to calculate the number of units you can put on a specific piece of property. So we are proposing to just eliminate that cap in RM4. You would still have to meet your parking requirements and your landscaping requirements, but if you can fit everything on the lot, in certain areas where we have good infrastructure and it makes sense, we didn't want to limit development in the RM4 zone. We have adjusted lot widths and frontage requirements and setbacks in the multifamily zones. I think for the most part, those changes provided more flexibility. I don't think there were any cases where we proposed to increase setbacks. We have also grouped parking requirements into 3 different categories for multifamily. So I guess, for example, and you all may recall some previous cases we've seen over the past couple of years, but property that's located in close proximity to WKU's main campus, we've seen that could, result in a greater need for parking. For example, our duplex standard today is 2 spaces per unit, but we've had instances where people have built 4-bedroom duplexes, meaning 4 bedrooms per unit, and when you're only required to provide 4 spaces total, but you have 8 bedrooms, that's become a nightmare in some situations. So we're proposing to make all of the parking, if you're within 1 mile of WKU's main campus, based on the number of bedrooms. Now, if you're outside a mile of the main campus, we've actually reduced the parking requirements to just 1 space per bedroom, and then there's also a 10% guest parking provision that would get added on top of that. In our downtown TIF Medical Center area, currently you're not required to provide parking if you're zoned central business, for example, and you've got a mixed use component. Maybe you've got retail on the first floor, but maybe the second and third stories are residential. We are proposing to actually add a requirement just for residential uses only, where each unit would just have 1 space per unit. This is a big change. If adopted as proposed, we're also hoping to allow garages in multifamily developments to count toward the required parking and the driveway if there's enough room. So basically now if we're looking at a site plan and maybe it requires 50 spaces, well, they've got 50 spaces, but in addition to that, they may have 20 units with garages. If you can actually block someone in, we wouldn't count that. So we're actually proposing, even if you are, you've got a drive and a garage, we're going to count that toward the required number of spaces. At least that's what we're proposing to do. Again, if there's enough room. We've also, I guess one of the common binding elements we see, I would say probably the majority of applications that come before you all, there's standard lighting requirements where people will commit that all lighting would be designed in a downward and inward manner to prevent light trespass onto adjacent properties. And so since that's just something that's commonly incorporated with applications, we're proposing to just make that a standard for everyone. We've tried to build in some landscaping flexibility, so we do have hard buffer widths in our ordinance currently. It may be a minimum of 5, average of 10, a minimum of 10, and sometimes that's just not feasible, it's not practical, but there are instances where we've had someone say, well, I would really like to make this up in this area. What if I planted some extra things here and shifted things this way? Or what if I have some foundation plantings? And so we're just trying to basically allow flexibility to shift that landscaping around as long as the spirit of the ordinance is still upheld and, you know, we're not just eliminating landscaping altogether. We've also clarified the maintenance requirement for landscaping. So right now, I think the way it's worded, it states that once you install your landscaping, you have to maintain it in a healthy growing condition for 3 years, a minimum of 3 years. Well, that doesn't mean that after 3 years, you just come in and rip out all of your trees and shrubs and just have no landscaping at all. We thought that went without saying, but here we are. We're going to clarify that you just have to maintain your landscaping. We've adjusted some parking requirements. I'll get to those. There's a whole chart in just a minute, so I won't spend much time on that. But we've also added a provision for temporary gravel parking for up to 1 year. So if there's sites that are under construction and maybe they've got some current parking that's going to need, you know, maybe they're going to build a building there now where their current parking is, they need to just shift some parking elsewhere, we're going to try to build in flexibility to allow temporary gravel. It's for 1 year. There are options where that can be extended if you're still developing a specific site. And then at the end of the temporary use, you could either pave and landscape it in accordance with the ordinance, or you can just pull up the gravel and put your grass back the way it was before. We've increased remote and shared parking distances. So currently, and I always get them mixed up, one is 500 feet and the other one is 600 feet. But basically, if you've got two properties, maybe one is an office professional type of use and then the other one is a residential use where they have different peak times where people would need to utilize the parking, you're able to share that same parking area. So we're just right now it has to be within 500 or 600 feet of either property that's going to share the parking area, but now we're proposing to increase that to 1,000. So basically give you more options to choose from. And then we've also revised stacking spaces for certain uses. Here's our proposed parking changes. We tried to reclassify certain medical uses. Right now, for example, if you're a medical office, you have to provide 1 space per 200 square feet of building area. We've kind of seen over time that if it's just like a general clinic, like, you know, I've got a cold, I'm just going to go see my doctor, that 1 to 200 is actually more than necessary. So we're proposing to just lump medical office uses just with regular offices, which would in turn require less parking. Now, hospitals and medical centers and outpatient surgical facilities and that type of thing would still have a different standard. We've also broken down restaurant specific uses between table service, counter service, and fast food. So those have slightly different standards depending on the type of restaurant. Standalone retail, we've actually reduced the amount of parking that's required if you're 20,000 square feet or larger. So our big box developments, as you all are probably aware, the parking that's available is there for Black Friday. And the, you know, we don't need to provide parking for Black Friday year round, so we're proposing to reduce that requirement. Then we have some provisions for mixed use developments. So currently, if you've got a strip center, let's say for example with 5 different tenants, you have to actually identify the use for each specific tenant, and then that's how we would calculate your parking. And if you can't, you know, if you can't limit the use, and we would just assume the most intense use. So right now, let's say you have 5 tenants and you're not really sure what the use is going to be, you would have to actually park it based on the restaurant parking standard, which is not really, it just doesn't make any sense. So we're proposing we've tried to research other places around the country that are similar to our community, and just try to come up with one standard, because we know that uses, even if you know for sure your first 5 tenants are going to be, an accountant's office and a nail salon and a restaurant and whatever it may be, 10 years from now, those uses are likely going to be different. So we've tried to come up with a standard that'll just work for everybody, and kind of be like a time, over time, that it's still going to work for everyone. So that's the proposed change there. And I think, so that's all of the parking changes. We also looked at our outdoor storage and display regulations and tried to simplify those. The way they're written now is pretty confusing, so we just tried to clarify and simplify those. Similar with the multifamily section, we're also proposing to add a lighting provision, and we've clarified where fences can be located. We've also added residential uses to several of our commercial zones, either as standalone uses or incorporated into a mixed-use development. And then getting into our industrial zones, you all may remember from some of the DDPs we've looked at lately, the fire department has had concerns about emergency vehicle access, but in cases where that's truly the only need for a travel way, for example, it's not open to employees, it doesn't lead to a parking area or some type of delivery door or loading or unloading dock. If it's just truly for emergency vehicles only, we have written in provisions to allow gravel for those areas only. We also have an option currently in our ordinance, so for parking of, semi-trucks and heavy equipment like bulldozers or dump trucks and that kind of thing, there is an option to utilize gravel as your parking surface, but there's also a requirement that you have to curb and gutter these parking areas to prevent gravel from spreading into other areas or onto adjoining properties. We've found out that's not really practical. So we're just trying to substitute the language to where just any type of containment material, if you can, put in a berm, like mound up some dirt, and plant some grass, and if that's going to hold it in, then that's just fine. So basically, be as creative as you'd like to be. As long as it's going to contain your gravel and keep it from spreading elsewhere, we're going to be okay with it. We've also clarified and simplified the outdoor storage and display regulations for industrial uses as well. Moving on to PUDs, the biggest thing we've changed here, so right now there are certain areas, the mall is probably the best example. It was rezoned under our old zoning ordinance prior to 2001. We had a planned shopping center zone and planned neighborhood zones, and then they just all got converted to PUDs, but they didn't have specific development standards like would be adopted today with a planned unit development. So somebody will call and say, oh, well, how big can my sign be? We have no clue. So then we just have to basically make our best guess as to, what zone it would be similar to. So we've actually just inserted a chart that says if you're zone PUD, but there are no development standards, if you're this use, you follow this standard. So that should hopefully help staff in, communicating standards to people that may call or stop in the office or apply for a permit. In our urban growth overlay district, so that'd be Lover's Lane and Cemetery Road, there are very minor changes. Most of them are just kind of to mirror other changes in the other portions of the ordinance. So sign changes, in the agricultural zones, we're proposing to reduce the permitted sign face area from 100 square feet to 32 square feet. That's what most of your agricultural signs are if you drive down the road. They're just a 4x8 sheet of plywood, which is 32 square feet. In residential areas, we're proposing to allow only monument-style signs for residential districts. So this would it really would only apply for a conditional use. So you might have a conditional use permit for a daycare, for example, in a residential zone. So this would just be for those types of signs. Entrance signs for a development, into a subdivision, those have their own standard. They wouldn't fall under this requirement. But we have also proposed to reduce the permitted sign face area to 60 square feet in multifamily zones. Again, that would be for conditional uses. And then in the commercial zones, we made minimal changes. The way we measure height of a sign today, you basically go to the crown of the nearest public street, and that's where you would measure your height from. That can be complicated sometimes. And also somewhat dangerous if you're like on a heavily traveled road and you're like trying to figure out the elevation of the crown of the street. So instead we're just going to measure from the ground to the top of the sign. I know that's just like crazy, right? But I guess we did also at least clarify that you can't just bring in like a mound of dirt and build it up like 20 feet tall and then put your sign on top of that to try to get extra sign height. But we are trying to at least be reasonable to say, just measure from the ground to the top of the sign. It could be that simple. We've also added an option for campus style signage. So I guess the best example, just downtown here at the medical center, you know, we have freestanding signage, we have wall signage, but then there's nothing in the ordinance that really allows, you know, directional signage that, you know, can help guide you through the whole development. So we're proposing an option just for that type of signage to hopefully allow some more flexibility. We're also proposing changes to the billboard section to allow digital billboards. This would be only static images, so you wouldn't have videos playing or anything like that. And those would be allowed to change no more than every 8 seconds. And there are also light controls that are written in this section as well. So jumping into Article 5, Article 5 basically outlines every type of use that you may think of, or we've tried to at least include them all, and then all of the different zoning districts and which uses are permitted in which zoning district, and then also specific use standards for individual uses. That's basically the bulk of Article 5. The first change we have here, we look at mixed use provisions. So we have, I think I mentioned this earlier, added residential components in some of our commercial zones, either as mixed use or standalone. We've also incorporated some modernized terms. We've added craft beverage production, so that would be for your microbreweries, craft distilleries, and wineries. We've also added the Airbnb, vacation rentals by owner, and better defined what a short-term rental is. So basically, if you have stays of less than 30 days, you're considered a short-term rental. You'd be treated no differently than a Holiday Inn or, you know, any hotel you might see on Scottsville Road. So we did clarify that. We've also introduced the term burial-related use. So right now I think it just says cemetery, which is, you know, as we all know, there could be more than just, you know, a cemetery involved with that type of use. So we've tried to modernize that language to allow some flexibility for those types of uses. For residential uses, we've added a clarification for the keeping and kenneling of dogs or other animals for property less than 2 acres. And we've also proposed a change to our home occupations. So right now, if you have a hair salon or a nail salon or a catering business, and, you know, those are the types of things, or even daycare for a limited number of children, that's where you can live in your home, apply for a conditional use permit for a home occupation, and not necessarily have to change the zone of your property. But one of those eligible home occupations currently in the ordinance is general contractors. You know, if you have a lawn care company, for example. We added this, it's probably been 4 or 5 years ago now. And there have been a few people who have applied for a conditional use permit for this specific use. But unfortunately, the track record and history of how those have operated, at least in adhering to their conditions, i.e. not having employees coming to the site, not having materials delivered to where it remains residential in character, hasn't actually worked out so favorably. So we are proposing to unfortunately remove that as an eligible home occupation. Under our institutional uses, we have reclassified and tried to better define certain medical related uses. Again, that kind of goes back to our parking requirements we were talking about earlier. In the commercial section, we've revised retail uses permitted in certain zones based on square footage. We've also, this is kind of a unique change, so in RM4, which is one of our multifamily zones, we've added commercial up to 4,000 square feet as an eligible conditional use. So you may have an area where someone comes in and says, oh, well, there's nowhere to buy groceries. What if we just have a small little market on the corner here, repurpose an existing home? Right now, you'd have to rezone to some type of commercial zone, which, as you may know, based on our future land use map, that may not be favorable, but we do recognize there are areas that could benefit from very small scale neighborhood businesses, so we have proposed to add that as a conditional use in RM4. We've also, I guess these last three on the page here, in response to variance requests that have been routinely approved by our Board of Adjustments, and also in conjunction with some of the zone change applications you have seen, we're proposing to reduce the separation distances for outdoor dining areas if there's no music or sports component. Also for drive-throughs with no speakers, and then also for fuel stations with no outdoor speakers. So we're proposing to reduce those setbacks. Again, that's based on past applications that have routinely been approved for variances. Let's see, we're still in the commercial use category here, but we have changed our bed and breakfast regulations to match KRS 100, including clarifying the number of rooms that are permitted. We've also clarified the types and sizes of event venues and requirements for event venues. We've proposed to increase buffers for firearm ranges, and we have also reclassified vehicle sales based on the federal highway classifications. So right now we have heavy vehicle sales, medium vehicle sales, light vehicle sales. Those are all very subjective terms. So, you know, someone comes in and says, oh, well, I want to sell, I don't know, tractors, or it could be a myriad of different things, but here we are, well, how much does that weigh? What's light? What's medium? And so the Federal Highway Administration actually has different classifications and clearly defines different types of vehicles. So we tried to actually define that into its own category, and that way we'll be able to better determine if it would be more appropriate in a light industrial or heavy industrial zone versus just general business or highway business, for example. In the industrial section, we've reclassified recycling, mulch and wood operations to a waste-related use. These would be allowed in the agricultural zone with a conditional use permit, and also in the heavy industrial zone. And we've introduced screening requirements for waste-related uses like junkyards and scrap yards. Right now, there are no specific use standards that require screening of these types of uses. This was kind of in response to several calls that we've had in the last year or so about these uses, with people saying, oh, well, don't they have to screen this? And we're like, well, no, not really. Not if you're, you know, unless you're adjoining an incompatible use, but if you're adjacent to an industrial use, for example, you wouldn't trigger an incompatible use buffer. So this would just be a hard standard that these uses would follow regardless of what's surrounding the property. In the temporary use section, we have limited or proposed to limit temporary uses to 4 times per calendar year per property before they would no longer be considered temporary, to where you would actually need to maybe look to rezone your property. Right now it says temporary uses can be no longer than 7 days at a time, but there's no limit to say, well, you know, you could apply for a temporary use permit once a month as long as you're not exceeding that 7 days. And we've also clarified that parking for temporary uses need to utilize existing parking areas or utilize the grass temporarily, and that you're not permitted to just come in and put gravel down, because that has happened in the past where someone, I guess fireworks stands are the best example. They'll come in, throw down a bunch of gravel, they're there for a couple weeks, and then here we are left with a gravel parking lot that's not allowed. And with that, I think that wraps up Article 5. Ben's going to take back over here, go through the rest of the changes.
That was the heavier stuff, so we'll move quickly through these last bits. So Article 6 has to do with our grandfathering non-conforming uses. We've proposed a few changes there. So in regards to non-conforming structures, currently our requirement is that that you only have 6 months to reestablish non-conforming rights if your structure was damaged, let's just say by fire. We kind of realize that that's a little short amount of time to work out all your insurance stuff and get maybe get checks and get back up and going to get your permits to rebuild your structure or to refurbish your structure. So we've changed that to 18 months, which is more common time period throughout the state. And then we've allowed a 6-month extension also for the difficult ones. Fortunately, it's not something we have to deal with too terribly often, but when it does happen, we want to make sure that that's a reasonable standard there. The next one's regarding uses. So we want to make a provision to allow for similar permitted uses. So if you have a use that's maybe the zoning ordinance has changed since you first used that use, maybe an old country store or something. Maybe it's zoned agriculture, but the store has obviously been a country store. It's been retail. So we want to be able to allow to change those structures to a similar permitted use, so another retail use, or maybe something less intense like an office or something like that. So it's a slow transition over time rather than just a hard standard, you can't use that anymore. So we want to make that change. It's another one that we don't see too often, but we'll make that provision. For non-conforming lots, we just clarify that only one single-family structure is allowed. And that is in response, again, from a request from neighborhoods to where there's been some instances where maybe 2 single-family structures or something's been on the same lot. So we've clarified that and kind of closed that. And then agriculture exception lots, we just want to make sure we point out that we're saying that those aren't non-conforming, those are just allowed by right. So we've just made that clarification as well. So nothing's changing there. In regard to non-conforming signs, we've just kind of clarified how that's administered. We've made a provision to allow sign faces to be replaced without it currently, the way it reads, you could argue that they would have to take the entire sign down and then put up a brand new sign that's, let's say, smaller than maybe what they have. But if it's an existing sign and the business owner, all they want to do is just replace the face of that sign, maybe modernize it a little, maybe they had a logo change or whatever. We're allowing that under this provision. They can't go bigger, of course, but they can, as long as it's 1-for-1 or a reduction, we've allowed that. Same thing with sign frames, if it's only the frame. If you're replacing both or the entire sign's being taken down, then of course you have to come in compliance with the existing regulations. So that's it for 6. 7 and 8, we're going to get a little easier here. 7 is enforcement. There's really no changes there. That just has to deal with our fining process, our code enforcement process. There's really no change there, just some terms and stuff to reflect all the other changes that we're proposing that we've went through. And then definitions, as you can imagine, as we go through this much change, adding the new uses, some of those things, we've had to clarify several definitions. We've had to add new definitions. I won't read all those to you, but I just wanted to point out so there's kind of the new definitions we have added. Of course, Article 8's online as well, so you can read all of those. And then there's all the definitions that have had some sort of revision as well. So we've added and or refined quite a few of those definitions in Article 8. So with that, the painful listening part is over. I'd be happy to answer any questions, either Rachel or I or anybody else. Not, I'll wrap it up, but I'll just ask if there's any questions at this time. Yes, ma'am.
Will this site development give us enough clout to handle a situation that might impact the neighborhood as adversely as that did to begin with because they did not live up to?
I would say it will have the same. So the requirements, we're kind of just changing the review process. We're not changing the required elements, and we're certainly not changing the zoning process because that's kind of set by state law. So short answer would probably be no, not in the sense I think you're asking. I think that part would be the same.
As I understand it, the site development, when it'll just be a fact, we won't be hearing the argument for or against. The staff will have either approved it or not approved it, right?
With the 5-day public review period, and then they will come before you and you will see them just like you do the subdivision. So you have that, you still have that opportunity to request a hearing at that time. So there'll be a slight, the only difference is there'll be just a slight change in that way that is handled. But detailed development plans now are largely just a staff checklist. So what the only check or challenge, I guess, that can be made on that detailed development plan is, did they meet the requirements or didn't they? And so that will still be there. All the binding elements, soon to be called development plan conditions, all of that compliance stuff, that will all still be in place, will all still be enforceable, and will all still be under the same requirement.
Will
now.
we be going over the, I've forgotten what you call it, instead of the binding elements, will we be hearing the site, the promises that they make?
Yeah, so you'll still be hearing the development plan conditions. That really is just a term change in that sense. So they'll still be required as part of their general development plan, and so it'll all be still heard in the same manner. They'll still be present. It's just when we say to give our staff report, it'll just say development plan conditions instead of binding elements, and we'll put in parentheses former binding elements for a while or something until we all get used to it.
Binding is more enforceable than condition.
I would say you are correct in the term itself, but the development plan conditions are still binding and in full force effect. It's just simply the way the KRS law is written. It just binding element term is reserved for consolidated local governments.
Anything else? No. Doesn't look like there are any other questions, and you guys have done such a great job. We don't have to ask the audience for questions since no one's here to protest anything.
Yeah. So just to kind of wrap that up, so we have had 2 public meetings, which you're aware of, and we've had the ones that I've mentioned. And of course, April 19th, we'll have we're going to ask you here in a minute to have a motion to recess this public hearing and continue that on April 19th. And I'll let Hamp come up with his famous language for that. But you have also at your seat that was passed out tonight a memo that we created and handed out for you today that has a we've asked you for that to be served as the staff report. We've went through and pulled out all the goals and objectives and action items out of the comprehensive plan that we feel relates to these changes. So, and then at the end of that, on the last page, I believe it's page 7, we have a suggested motions there where we reference those. So we wanted to provide that to you early so you could look through those and decide which one of those you feel applies. Should we be moving to approval on the 19th? So at the 19th meeting, I think we will go through any of the changes or comments we've received. Again, we've had the public comment period open for, it'll be approximately a month by the time we have that ready. And we will, after we meet with the realtors on Monday, we will take the comments like we heard tonight and make some further changes, and we will upload those changes. They will be marked in blue. Let's just say Tuesday-ish, depending on how fast we can get them done and uploaded. And we will also make sure we get those to you in the next packets for the meeting. That'll just call out those changes. So again, we'll include that. We'll probably go ahead and include this memo again. And then we might highlight some of those 22 objectives and action items that we've pulled out and review those. And we won't go through this whole presentation again unless there's a need to. So just wanted to give you that update. Rachel, you got anything else you can think of? Okay.
Thank you. I think it looks good. It looks great. It looks great, better than good. Hemp, you have a motion for us to,
So, I think the action that you might consider taking is to recess this public hearing to reconvene on April 19th, 2018, for conclusion of the hearing and action on the proposed amendments.
thank you. In a second, we have that. Thank you, sir.
Commissioner Rich? Commissioner Martins?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Balance?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Coppinger? Commissioner Graham?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Gay?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Warren? Commissioner Madison?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Houston?
Yes, ma'am.
Chair Runner?
Yes, ma'am. The motion carried, and that's what we'll do. The new business, we need to go into closed session. Anything before we vote to do that? Nothing.
No, I don't think there'll be any action after the
After,
closed
okay.
session too, so we can probably go ahead and.
Okay, we
let the
can go ahead
TV
and
excuse the
let,
TV, yeah.
excuse the TV,
Yeah.
tell them that we'll be finished. Okay, we need a,
So,
yes,
motion to go into closed session would be for the purpose of discussing pending litigation and
The personnel actions.
personnel actions which might lead to the hiring or termination of an employee.
thank you, and we need a second? Thank you.
Commissioner Martins?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Balance? Commissioner Coppinger? Yes, ma'am. Commissioner Graham?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Gay?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Warren? Commissioner Madison? Commissioner Houston?
Yes, ma'am.
Chair Runner?
Yes, ma'am. We'll give them a second.
For so many years, and we're just so outdated.